The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought. Glad to have you with us tonight. As I've often stated before, with this show we hope to promote thoughtful discussion amongst thoughtful people. If I may be presumptuous enough to suggest that we are all here in the studio thoughtful, I know the listeners are. Anyway, in that light, you can call in here and share your thoughts and questions with us. 225-343-9927, 343-9927. And tonight's topic will be hydraulic fracturing, commonly known as fracking. What is it, and what really is the big deal about it? And assisting me tonight, as always, are Lang Baker. Evening, Lang.
Hi, Wayne.
And Johnny Parker.
Hi, Wayne.
Hey, John. Good to have you. Good to have everyone here. I'll start things off, guys, by talking briefly about what hydraulic fracturing is, just in case there's anybody in the listening audience who doesn't fully understand it. I'm looking at a paper here that was published by it was published in the Huffington Post, but the study was commissioned by the Endocrine Society. And it's titled Estrogen and Androgen Receptor Activities of Hydraulic Fracturing Chemicals and Surface and Groundwater in Drilling Dense Region. And, of course, they describe hydraulic fracturing here as it involves the underground injection of several million gallons of water combined with chemicals and suspended solids into each well under high pressure. And they state here that more than 750 chemicals are reportedly used throughout this process, and of these, more than 100 are known or suspected endocrine disrupting chemicals, EDCs they call them, and still others are toxicants and or carcinogens. And an endocrine disruptor, I looked up, is some kind of chemical that at certain doses can interfere with the hormonal systems. And of course that's where the anti-estrogen and anti-androgens come from. Those are for the female and male hormones, I suppose, and they disrupt those. But they say that more than 100 of the chemicals that they believe are used in fracking, although they still don't know the actual chemicals they're using, but they have determined that those chemicals do have effects causing cancer, tumors, and the like. And, of course, with all these concerns, they also point out that little or no research into the health effects of fracking has been done. And, of course, as we all know, the hydraulic fracturing was exempted from multiple federal regulatory acts in 2005, including the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Clean Air Act. And you guys may be wondering how they went about all this, but they took surface water samples, surface water they consider water collected on the ground, such as rivers, creeks, and ponds. And they took groundwater samples, which are underground. They classify those as underground, typically accessed via drinking or monitoring wells. Artesia water supplies were defined as groundwater sources that had flowed to the surface under pressure and were collected there. But they also took control samples in areas where there either was no fracking or drilling anywhere, or just a few. I think it was one every 2 square miles at the most they allowed. And what I found interesting, I often wondered, well, why do they even put chemicals in it? Because I'm thinking, just they want the hydraulic pressure, and you only need water, which is a great, hydraulic fluid, because it won't compress. So I couldn't understand why they were using this stuff, but they inject some of the, or some organic compounds to reduce friction during drilling. And of course, the injection, I guess, or it's going on while they are drilling. They also use some to increase the viscosity of the fluid, and I'm guessing that's it makes it thicker, sort of. It flows less easily, so it won't seep through cracks as easily. So it would make it easier, I think, to pressurize the seams. And then there's also chemicals for antibacterial purposes. And another thing that surprised me was that when they're in the act of actually fracturing the different plates, I think that's the correct word, plates, 40% of the fluid is as often comes back up as backflow or flow back, they call it. And this water that comes back contains not only the chemicals in put into the fracturing liquid, but also heavy metals and radioactive compounds that occur naturally in the earth that don't normally come to the surface. And of course, a lot of these things end up being leaked out in different ways. They talk here about how the many pathways for these chemicals to get into surface and groundwaters is spills during transport. They have to collect the water when it comes back and dispose of it. We talked briefly about that. That's actually, was one of you going to mention the earthquakes? Okay. There's also the drilling and fracturing processes themselves. There's the disposal of wastewater, failure of well casings, and structural issues surrounding abandoned wells. And they also point out in this study that there are many cases where there's a direct connection between aquifers and some of these shallow wells and everything. And so I think it was shallow spill sites have known to have various types of connections. Blah, 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 blah.
Actually, based on the research I found, Wayne, most of the issues are going to be surface water issues. Any of the, I think they call it gas migration, when it comes up through the different formations and sands up to the drinking water aquifers.
Yeah.
There is not an awful lot of evidence there about contamination of aquifers from the actual fracturing. The evidence shows that it's coming up through the wellbore itself, and the wellbore casings are cemented, in different lengths and sections all the way up. And it's these sections and these areas where the cement casing is being installed poorly, and that's where some of the leakage comes out, either during the fracturing hydraulic process itself, where the high pressure forces those fluids in there and they intermix, or during the production process when the flow starts back up to the surface and they start producing gas and oil from that point of view. Okay. So that's where most of the leaks, I think, that they have found contamination in terms of groundwater, not surface water, due to the fracking process.
Okay. What I have here in my notes, while you were explaining that to me, I found it. It says here, it was also reported that natural connectivity between shallow drinking water aquifers and formations deep underground exist in many areas, suggesting a route for the potential migration of natural gas drilling fluids into groundwater. Okay, and you're saying there was not that much. I mean, this is an hypothesis here, as they admit that. So you're saying there's no evidence yet, huh?
Well, based on all the research I did, there's not a lot of direct correlation that even the experts, based on a pretty wide range of sites that I went to.
Yeah, but I was thinking, like, given what they already know about the levels of dangerous chemicals that seem to correlate with a lot of dense drilling, you would think we would know these things, or we would have done research, or whatever.
Well, there is a great concern and a great fear, and that's one of the clouds hanging over the whole industry, is that particular concern. The migration directly up from the fractured sands up hundreds, thousands of feet, because typically they're fracturing at sands and formations anywhere from 2,000, 5,000 feet down. And I tried to find the typical depths of the water sands and aquifers, and I could only find, 200, 500 feet. So their thinking is, and their work, shows them that they're not close enough, but every formation is different. Every drilling site is different. So the fear is that, yes, over time it will fracture up, because the fracture goes up vertically once you get down to the depths. That's the reason they run the fracking pipe horizontal, because at that low of a depth, the hydraulic pressure, the fractures go vertical, They go vertical up through the sand instead of horizontal through the sand. So they have to run the pipe horizontal.
Right.
So from a bird's eye view, a couple of issues here are where the chemicals end up and what exposure people may be subject to. And on another issue here is just what are these chemicals and what kinds of effects do they have. And it sounds like there's not a whole lot of evidence to show they're safe. There's not a...
But there's no evidence to show they aren't safe.
Well...
Sorry, playing the devil's advocate.
I understand. But what I'm saying is who has the burden? I mean, if you're going to be producing new chemicals and exposing the public to it, who needs to show that they're safe?
Right.
And one difficulty, hurdle to finding out whether they're safe or not is a lot of these chemicals are classified as trade secrets or proprietary, and we don't really know what chemicals are being used.
Yeah, it reminds me of a lot of the chemicals they're now getting for putting people to death in the chemical injection. Well, they don't reveal the chemicals they're using. I mean, that's such an important topic, and we don't know about it, and they're allowed to get away with that. But anyway,
Yeah, y'all are hitting on one of the issues that I ran across was in Europe they have moved toward a different burden of proof. Europe, they're moving to the opposite side where the burden of proof is on the companies to prove that what they're doing is safe. Whereas over here in the U.S., like you said, Lang, it's just the opposite.
Yeah, it's an ancient doctrine from the medical profession, first do no harm.
yeah, and I was fixing to say, with drugs, I mean, except for local incidences or isolated instances of corruption and whatever, or suspected corruption, they have to prove that their drugs are effective and relatively safe.
Safe and effective.
Safe and effective, right.
The two burdens of proof.
Yeah, but yet with fracking, apparently there's nothing like that. What else did you find? Like you did look into the regulations?
Well, I was looking into, regulations, statutes, ordinances, and the fear people have about being exposed to stuff that's potentially dangerous without any kind of regulation over it. And at the top level, the federal government's basically backed off of addressing this. There were some federal regulations proposed by the Bureau of Land Management which would apply only on lands under their jurisdiction. They wouldn't apply to the country as a whole. And those rules were challenged in court in Wyoming by the oil and gas industry, and the trial judge ruled against them, saying that the agency had no authority to do any kind of regulating of the fracking industry, and that's on appeal now. They expect a decision early next year. A large number of law professors who are experts in that area of the law think the decision was incorrect and expect it to be overturned on appeal, but that's still to be seen.
Yes, it is.
So in the absence of federal regulation, it's left to the states and localities, and there are a good number of states, particularly in oil industry states, where localities impacted by this have attempted to regulate or prohibit fracking, like right here nearby in St. Tammany Parish, and the state courts in many cases, many states have declared that violating being preempted by the state's regulatory agency for the oil and gas industry. So the trial judge in the St. Tammany Parish case struck down their local ordinance, saying it violated, that there was the Department of Natural Resources that has exclusive jurisdiction, and the Louisiana Supreme Court refused to hear the appeal in the case, so that stands. Similar result happened in Texas, where Denton, a small town north of Dallas-Fort Worth, was the first city in Texas to ban fracking inside the city limits, and then the state legislature passed a law prohibiting local regulation. And Oklahoma had the same kind of thing happen, but then after the earthquakes up there, the governor issued a ban on the injection wells, which are used to dispose of the wastewater from fracking, because that was the suspected cause of the earthquakes that caused quite a bit of damage and was felt in a number of states
Yes.
Oklahoma and surrounding states.
Yes, I remember when they were happening a lot in Oklahoma. I heard a story or saw a story where they traced it to the injection wells.
Right.
They didn't specify in the story, though, that it was the fracking water that was being put in. They just said wastewater was being injected into these wells. They didn't say where it was coming from. You know, it just occurred to me when you were talking about the local ordinances and the state law overriding local ordinances, but yet at the same time they're saying that the federal government can't override state laws in that case. So they're playing it from both ends from the looks of it, just trying to keep the practice going.
Yeah, these reactions in Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, that's because of the strength of the oil and gas industry in those states. And
Money,
the
yeah.
importance for the economies of
Yes.
those states.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I guess frustrates me in a way is, and I used to make the argument, but people say, what about our jobs? And I actually remember seeing a guy in a comment on the local newspaper here, and I realize it's just a comment form, and we know the caliber usually of the comments there, but one guy said, the heck with the environment, you need to worry about your job. And I just shook my head, wasn't it in the 70s when there was a canal up connected to Lake Erie that caught fire because of all the pollutants, but people don't remember that, don't know about it. Anyway, Lang, you got anything else? Let me remind the listeners real quickly, though. You are listening to A Pause for Thought. We are discussing fracking. We have me, Wayne Parker, Lang Baker, and Johnny Parker here discussing it. And you can call in 343-9927 if you'd like to share your thoughts and insights or challenge a comment that one of us has made. The only requirements are that you be respectful about it. Anyway, okay, Lang?
Well, it's a hot dispute among the populace in other states as well. In Colorado, Longmont, which is kind of a suburb community in the Denver area, passed the first fracking ban in that state, and it was struck down like the ones in Oklahoma, Texas, and Louisiana. But there was a drive for a ballot initiative to put it on the ballot next month, in November. But they fell short in the signature gathering. They needed 98,500, and they only got 80,000. So I imagine that they'll gather signatures for the next round of ballot initiatives. But the battle goes on there. In New York, there were over 200 municipalities that passed fracking bans, and the state commissioned a study, and then Governor Cuomo issued a statewide ban, after the report from the study came in. And there are a number of counties in the western part of the state adjacent to Pennsylvania that were talking about seceding from New York and joining Pennsylvania where they could continue their fracking. So
Right.
there are some localities that want it because of the economic benefits.
But
they're willing to sacrifice their environment to...
Here again, there's no
get the
proof
money.
yet. And, I guess their self-interest, as is the case with most human beings, is going to win out against mere speculation. And who knows, we have people who deny that it's man-made climate change, so I'm sure they can easily convince people that fracking is safe, entirely safe, and there are no risks.
That's kind of a sample of what's going on in some of the states in battling it. And another front is trying to get disclosure of what those chemicals are. Louisiana has a disclosure law, but then they have an exemption if it's proprietary information, so that doesn't really allow.
Yeah, well,
much.
you've given me some encouraging information anyway. We don't hear much about the continuing battle, or that there even is a continuing battle going on to stop it, or at least learn what it's doing and how it's affecting the environment. So that's encouraging that people are still out there fighting, and I think we all need to know about those things.
And the BLM regulations rules that were adopted and then struck down by the court and still on appeal, those rules required disclosure of the chemicals that were being used.
Good.
So if the trial court gets reversed on appeal, then at least for those particular wells there will be some disclosure of what chemicals are being used.
Okay. And fracking hasn't been going on a real long time, maybe a couple of decades, I guess.
Some of the first was actually back in the 70s, but I think in 87 it really took off,
Okay.
started taking off, yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's a long time, delay before effects start showing. So if we can stop it within the next 10 years, the number of people who are hurt by it will be minimized.
Yeah. I
Maybe-
think
Well, that depends on how the harm occurs. If it's a slow process for these chemicals to eventually work their ways into the aquifers, and the chemicals are already there, it's kind of like a delayed revelation of what the impact is, like we're seeing with climate change.
Yeah, good
Exactly.
point. Good
Yeah.
point. Yeah, and we just don't know, and that's the problem, I guess. Johnny, go ahead, Lang.
I was just going to say that climate change is another issue connected to this that isn't really talked about that much. Is this is also putting a lot more fossil fuels, extracting a lot more fossil fuels that will then be burned and add to the CO2 levels in the atmosphere. And
Yep.
that's why some of the climate movement activists are calling for leave it in the ground.
Yeah, at
So
some point,
apart from the chemical contamination
Right.
issues in the earthquakes, there's the climate issue too.
and at some point, humanity is going to have to face the fact that we can't continue to suck out all the oil from the earth. It's got to be finite. It's taken too long for it to form, for us to go on forever pumping it out the rate we're pumping it.
Right, following up on Lang's comment there on air pollution, the methane gassing off and release at some of the hydraulic pumping stations there in the fracking process gas off a significant amount of methane. And we all know from our last, one of our last previous programs about methane's effect on global warming is I don't know, several thousand times CO2
Yes.
in terms of the amount
Greenhouse
of
effect, yeah.
greenhouse effect there. And there is, by the way, legislation that was supposed to come into effect 2015, which would require the industry to reduce those methane emissions directly in the atmosphere 95%. So significant drop.
Yeah.
I don't know what the status of that is, but they have to start meeting that requirement sometime 2015 or 2016.
I'm surprised they aren't already, in a way. I don't know how difficult it is to capture methane, gassing off of wells and whatnot. But I know that when the EPA come down on oil refineries to reduce sulfur levels in their products that they were selling to the consumer or, to industries, they were told to remove 99 point something % of the sulfur, and they do. And they make money off it. Well, they sell the sulfur that they extract, but I've seen them hauling it out in railroad tank cars and everything else, just almost pure liquid sulfur.
And while we're on this topic, one source that I read also stated that there's more methane gas off at conventional gas wells than fracking gas wells. So I don't know if that legislation is retroactive. I know a lot is not. Regulatory is not retroactive to existing,
Well, yeah, but, Johnny, for the coal industry, they did pass regulations requiring them to put scrubbers and everything else on their
Right.
smokestacks. So, and then the existing company plants had to do it. So
right.
they may be able. There may be
Yep.
a legal precedent for that.
Now, one of the other issues that I looked at were some of the environmental concerns. If you just start at the top of the surface, where the fracking actually, all the equipment takes place, the major concern and issue is the use of groundwater to carry the fracking chemicals and simply to deliver the pressure, the hydraulic pressure down to the gas and oil producing sands. And one site I visited said that it requires 70 to 140 billion gallons of water per year to fracture up to 35,000 wells that are fracking wells. And if you do the math on another site, it's basically anywhere from 1 to 3 million gallons to do the initial fracturing of any particular well. And over the life of that well is estimated up to 8 million gallons of water. Now, the problem that brings up is that now where these fields are located is causing water competition between the oil and gas industry with ranchers, with agriculture, with farmers, and with human water consumption. And it's most serious, of course, in those areas that have drought from time to time. And there are cities in Texas and New Mexico that have basically, in agriculture areas, that have lost all their water,
Yeah.
period. So that's one of the most serious ones. When it comes to human issues, environmental issues, it's silicosis, which is not talked about very much. Sand is made up of silicon. Sand is the predominant solid that is pumped down to actually do the fracture. And the sand is certain different sizes. It's a quartz silica. And part of the reason it's pumped down there is to not only open up the fractures, but to keep the fractures open. So a certain amount of that sand stays in the ground there, holding the fractures apart. So there's a tremendous amount of sand that's processed up on the surface around the well itself. And most of them have what you call a yellow plume surrounding them. So there's a lot of worker safety regulations that are going on, and there's a lot of serious short-term and long-term exposure that can create this illness. And it's not really being talked about now.
No, but I'm thinking, you know, they recognize the hazards to the workers, the toxic hazards, and we know that this stuff gets, you know, leaks and whatever, you know, does get into our surface water, but nothing for everybody else, just the guys working on it. I mean, I'm glad they're protected to some extent, but that's interesting.
Now, the other significant human danger is the treatment of the wastewater, the flowback when it comes up. And as Lang has mentioned before, the injection wells are a serious problem, can create earthquake, seismic activity, which has been building, by the way, since 1975. And 2015, it peaked at over 1,000 earthquakes in central U.S. that were greater than magnitude 3.0, which is considered the breaking point where we can actually feel the earthquake, the seismic activity.
I see your graph there, Johnny, and the red lines on it. Where are the lower red lines? Where do they start?
Well, they start down here, probably 20 to 30. And the blue lines from 1975 to 2008 were, you know, in the 20 areas, below 20.
Okay, so...
And it really jumped up starting in 2008. And then really jumped again in 2012.
Sure.
So that's where we've been seeing the increased quake activity. Now, the other issue on human health issues, before we run out of time real quick, is that in Pennsylvania, this flowback wastewater, for a number of years, up to around 2012, some of it has not been placed back into injection wells. It's been going to municipal wastewater facilities, which are very ill-equipped and very unregulated, with very little testing, that cannot handle the radioactive material in the wastewater. And this has been processed and put into surface water, rivers that are upstream of drinking water inlets to cities and towns downstream. So Pennsylvania's had a real issue here, and they're grappling with that.
Wow. Yeah, we thought Flint, Michigan was bad, right? I mean, they were, but man. Well, you've been listening to, and are listening to, A Pause for Thought. We're discussing hydraulic fracturing to obtain oil and gas, commonly called fracking, with Lang Baker and John Parker. We still have a few minutes left if you want to give us a quick call. 343-9927, 343-9927. You know, John, you mentioned they draw surface water, like from rivers and ponds and whatnot, to provide the main carrier fluid, the water to carry the chemicals in for the fracturing, right?
Well, actually, most of it is from drilling, from wells.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, very little. There's not any amount of surface water. The other interesting thing is that the water, if they don't have water available within a certain distance of the wells that they can drill and bring water up, they have to truck it in.
Well, the reason I was asking that is because when I lived up in St. Helena Parish several years ago, I saw trucks bringing in drilling equipment and all kinds of things, and these wastewater trucks, you know, that say on the side, they collect water, but they ran a temporary pipe, about 8-inch diameter pipe, from the Amite River all along Highway 10, up Highway 38, and then it disappeared somewhere in the woods. But they ran it along the shoulder, they ran it down through the culverts underneath people's driveways and whatnot, and it was there for a long time, and then it went away. And I was speculating